In today's video, we're going to take a look at creating all of the general CSS styles for our application. This is going to include the background color, all of our header styles, as well as our various different button styles. Let's get started now. The first thing we need to do in order to make our actual pages look the same as our mockup over here is to import the font that we're using in this project. I already have all of my font files over here converted to web font size, and the way that I did this is using transfonter. And transfonter essentially will convert all of the fonts that you want and generate the CSS in order to use those fonts. So let me copy over the CSS that it created, and I'll create a new folder in our public here. It's going to be called Style Sheets. And inside of that folder, we're going to create another folder which is called Shared, which is where we're going to put all of our shared style sheets. And I'll paste in that font's CSS file. And the only thing that I changed inside of here was I changed the route of our URL because by default it doesn't have this /fonts here, so I added that in because we put this inside of a fonts folder here. Now, in order to actually include all of these different fonts inside of our project, we need to include a new style sheet, which I'm just going to call this main.css. And then inside of here, I want to import these different styles. The easiest way to do that is to use the @import syntax from CSS. We can pass it in the file we want to import, which is fonts.css, just like this, and it'll import that into our project. Now we want to actually include this font, so we'll say our root font family is going to be that font family, which is just going to be called Gotham Rounded. Just like that, we'll wrap it in quotes so it looks a little bit nicer. And that's all we need to do here. We'll also just bump up the font size just a little bit so it's easier to see. So we'll say font size 20 pixels. Now if we save that and refresh, you'll notice that nothing actually changes over here, and that's because we need to include this inside of our layout view. So in here, let's add a link tag. We want to make this link tag say that's a style sheet, just like that. Make sure this is an equal, and we also want to change this so that it's pointing towards that style sheet we just created. So we'll say style sheets /main.css, close that off, save it, and refresh. And you notice that our font changes to be the font that we defined here instead of our main.css Gotham Rounded, which is perfect. Now that we have all of our fonts defined, let's work on styling our background so that we have this nice blue colored background. Easiest way to do that is to use our body element, and we just want to apply a background to it. In our case, we're going to apply a linear gradient because it's slightly darker on the left-hand side and brighter on the right-hand side. So in this gradient, we want to say to right, which is essentially saying from left to right. And we want to apply two different colors. This first color is going to be the left side color, and the second color is the right side color. And we're just going to use variables to define these. So we're going to create a variable called the background dark, color background dark. And we're also going to do the same thing for light. So we'll say variable color background light. And we're going to define these variables inside of a new CSS file in this shared folder, which we're going to call variables.css. And inside of here, we'll define all the different variables inside of our root element. Our first one is going to be that color background dark. And this variable is going to be defined using HSL for our color scheme. We're going to have our hue as 200. We want to have our saturation value here be 100%. And for our lightness, we're just going to use 8% since we want it to be fairly dark. We can copy this down, do the exact same thing for light, but instead here, we'll use 16% instead of 8%. And of course, we need to make sure we import this file. So let's import that variables just in there like that. And now if we refresh our page over here, you'll notice we get that nice dark background color all the way across, the same as we have over here. But of course, we want to change the coloring of all of our different elements on our page because black does not look good on this blue. Let's change this color to be another variable, which we're just going to call color text light. And again, let's define that variable inside our variables.css, because as you can see, it's this off blue color that's very similar to our background. So we define that variable, which is color text light, and this is just going to be, again, an HSL with the exact same hue of 200. Then we're going to have saturation, again, of 100%, and this lightness value is just going to be a lot brighter at 87%. Now if we save that, refresh our page over here, you'll see that our text has changed to that nice white color, except for our links because we need to change those separately, since links define their own color by default. Now before we get any farther, you may notice that we have this 200 value as our hue in all of our different variables, and this is going to be the case for everything we create. It's all going to be based on a hue of 200. So let's define that as our own variable, which is just going to be called our base hue. we're going to set this to be 200. And then inside of here, we're just going to access that variable. Instead of accessing 200, we'll say var color base hue. And the reason we're doing this is because we can actually change the hue of our site at any time by changing this single variable, and we'll change the entire color of our site. For example, if we change this to 100 and save and refresh, you see we now have a green site. And let's change it to 300, for example, refresh, and now we have a purpley pink looking site, and so on. And we can change this whenever we want if you wanted a different colored site than this blue color. Now with our colors taken care of, let's take a look at our normal example here. Zoom this out to 100% and make it full screen. And as you can see, all of our content stays inside of this single container. As you can see, as soon as our screen gets to this size, nothing expands past it. And this inner container here is slightly indented on the sides, on both sides. As you can see, this recently added, slightly indented from this MyBerry logo. So what we want to do is we actually want to create that container class that wraps all of our content, and then a separate inside container that wraps all the content inside of this section here, so that our header is slightly wider than our content. We can do that inside of our main here. We can create a class called container, and this container is going to have a max width, which we're going to set to 1200 pixels. We want the margin to be auto. This essentially is going to add equal margin on the left and the right of our container so that it's always centered. Also, we want to add a margin on the bottom, which is just going to be 3 rem, and this way our content never touches the very bottom of our screen. It'll be 3 rem away from the bottom. And then an inner container, this is just going to be inside of this other container that we defined, and it's just going to be slightly inset, as you can see, a few little rem inset here. So we can say we want the margin to be 0 on the top and bottom. We want it to be 2 rem on the left and right, so it's slightly indented on both sides. Now, if we can save that and add this into our layout.egs in here. So we want to create that div inside of here, which is going to have the class of container. And this is going to be where all of our content is inside of. And then we also want that inner container, since as we mentioned, our header is slightly wider. So everything except for our header is going to be inside that inner container. Close that off. And there we go. Now if we save that, refresh over here, you see that recently added and such is slightly inset from our header. And if we increase the size of our page, you'll see at 1200 pixels, it centers it and doesn't go any wider, which is perfect. Next, I want to add a really nice little helper thing in here, which we're going to select all elements. We want to select all before elements, and we want to select all after elements as well. And we're just going to say that we want the box sizing of these to be border box, and this will make sizing our widths, heights much easier if we have padding or margin on these elements. Now with that out of the way, let's go back to our other example here and work on styling what our header is going to look like. As you can see, we have this massive link for the home page on the left and links to all of our other pages on the right. So let's create a new file in our shared here. We're just going to call this header.css, and inside of here, we'll define all of our different header variables and CSS styling that we need to do. But before we do that, we actually need to style our header.egs with classes so that we know how to select it in our CSS. The first thing that we need to do is we need to add a class to our nav here so that we know which nav we're selecting. And this is going to be called our header nav. And then here we're going to have our header title. So we'll just give this a class of header title so that we can select this later in our CSS. And then we have a bunch of different links here. All of these LIs are different links. So we're going to give these a class of header link. I'm going to copy this down to all of our different LIs since all of them are going to be sharing that exact same header link class. And that's all the actual CSS classes we need to add to our HTML in order to style our header just like this. Now instead of our header.css, let's first select our header title. And inside of here, the first thing we want to do is change the color because as you can see right now, it's the standard link color. So let's change the color in here to be equal to that light text color that we defined. So we can say color text light, close that off, save it. And if we include this in our main.css, we want to make sure we define it after our variables.css. So we'll do the import shared/header.css, save that. Now if we refresh over here, you'll see that the color of that has changed to be the same color as the rest of our text. This is perfect. Also, inside of there, we want to do a few other things. We want to remove the underline, so we'll say text decoration is going to be none. We want to change the font size to be quite a bit larger, so we'll say that the font size is going to be equal to a variable, which we're going to define, which is going to be called nav title font size. And this will just allow us to easily change the font size of our large links without having to find all the different places we define the font size. Also, we want to set the font weight to be also equal to a variable, which we're going to set to nav title font weight. Again, this just makes it easier to change in the future. Now we should define those variables. We can head up here, select our root element, and we can define those variables. So we're going to have our nav title font size, which in our case is going to be 3 rem. And we can do the exact same thing, but we can do it for our font weight. So title font weight, and that is going to be bold. Now we can save that, refresh over here, and we have a much larger, much bolder version of our title. And you notice that we have to constantly keep refreshing this page every time we change our CSS, but we just want it to automatically refresh for us. So we're going to use Live Server to do that. But Live Server doesn't work by default when you're using a server such as Node.js. So I have an extension installed called Live Server Web Extension. You can download this for pretty much any browser, and what it allows you to do is when you turn it on, you pass it the URL here, which is going to be the URL of your server, in our case, localhost 3000, paste that in here, and then our live server address. It should be most likely whatever's the default, so when you click Go Live down here, it's going to open up a new tab, and whatever this URL is right here is what you're going to copy in and paste into this section. And then once that's done, now if we go back over here, and let's say we make a change, we want to make this 5 rem, if we save, it's going to automatically refresh our page on the right, so we don't have to worry about doing that refreshing stuff that we don't like doing. This is going to be great and make working with this much easier. Now with our title out of the way, let's work on styling our nav elements so that they line up on the side just like this. First thing we want to do is select that header nav class that we created, and inside of here we're going to set the display to be flex so that we can display these elements side by side. We also want to make it so that these elements will wrap. So we're going to set the flex wrap to wrap, and this essentially means that the elements will wrap. As you can see when our screen gets too small, they'll wrap down like this instead of expanding past the edge of our screen. Let's make that a little bigger so it's easier to see. Then we want to justify the content to be spaced between, so that way there's as much space between this header on the left and all of our different links on the right hand side. We want to align the items in the center. This is just so that our text on the right here is centered with our text on the left. And lastly, we want to just add some margin to the bottom of this header. We'll just do 5 rem. That way our content is spaced out from each other. Now if you save that, look back over here, you'll see our links are pushed over to the right side, and we have our other link pushed over to the left side. So now we can work on styling the links inside of this unordered list. Luckily, doing so is fairly straightforward. We again want to select our header nav. We want to select the unordered list, which represents these items over here. And we want to change this to be display flex, so that they're side by side again. And we're going to set the margin to be 0. And we want the padding to be 0, so that we have no extra spacing around our UL element. Now if we save that, we have everything side by side, and we can work on styling the actual links themselves. So we can select the LI items and the actual links inside of those LI items. And in here, we can set text decoration to be none. We want to set the color again to be equal to that color variable that we defined, so we'll say color text light. And we want to set the font weight to be equal to another variable that we're going to define, which is going to be called nav link font weight. And lastly, we want padding between all these, so we'll just use 1 rem padding between each one of our links. Now if we save that, you see that our links are quite a bit more spaced out from each other, which is perfect. Also, you'll notice that we have our list styling still showing up. So let's select our header nav li elements, and we're just going to change that list style to be none. So that way we don't have to worry about those annoying dots showing up. And there we go. Now our links are looking almost exactly the same as our links over here. But you'll notice they're way too bold, and we need them to be this nice fine font weight. So let's define that variable up here. We have it called nav link font weight. And we're just going to set this to 300, which is a nice light color. And there you go, we have our nice light font weight. And lastly, all we need to do is give these a hover effect so that they turn white, as you can see over here when we hover over them. This again is fairly straightforward. We can just go down here, select our header nav, and we want to select our LIs and the anchor tags, so when we hover over those. And we also want to do this for our header title whenever we hover over that. And all we want to do is change the color to be white. Now, when we hover over each of these elements, you can see that the color is changing to be white instead of blue. You'll also notice we actually didn't use these header link classes that we defined inside of our HTML, so we can remove these so that our HTML is cleaner and not cluttered with classes we don't actually need. Now we can save that, and you can see everything still works just as before. Now you may notice that this page is looking a lot like our page over here, but the main difference is that our recently added text, our page header, is slightly larger on this page than it is on this page. Also, the book covers are different sizes, but we'll worry about that later. Let's first focus on this recently added text and making our page header larger. So instead of our main.css, let's add another selector here. We're just going to call this page header, which is a class we'll add to all of our page headers. And we want to make the font size on this to rem, and we want to make the font weight for this to be 500. Now if we save that, you'll see nothing happens, and that's because we need to apply this page header class to all of our page headers. So inside of our views, let's first just do this on our index page, since that's the one we're currently on. We have our page header here, so we'll add a class. We'll set it equal to page header. And now if you save that, you'll see that we have a nice large, easy to read page header as opposed to the much smaller one. So now let's copy that class over to all of our different pages. So let's go to all of our views. We'll start with our book views. In here, we'll paste in that class page header. And we're going to do this for all of our different views, so that way we have a nice consistent page header look on every single one of our views. Get that inside of our show page. We'll do the same thing now with authors. We'll do the edit page, the search page, the new page, and lastly, the show page. Now, no matter which page we go to, you see that we have this nice looking header on every single one of our pages that looks exactly the same. That's perfect. Now that we have all of our page headers done, let's look at our other mockup here, and you can see that something that a lot of our pages share and have in common is a bunch of different buttons that are all styled exactly the same. So the next thing we want to focus on is creating these classes for these different buttons. We have two different styles. We have this primary button here, and we have what we're going to call the danger button, which is essentially the delete button. Let's create a brand new style sheet inside of our shared folder here. We're just going to call this buttons.css, and inside of here, we'll define all of our button code. We'll also make sure to include this inside of here, so we'll include buttons.css, so that all of the code that we write inside of here will be included in our main.css file. The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a base button class, and this button class is going to be applied to all of our buttons and shared between our primary and danger buttons, and this essentially defines the look and feel of the button minus the actual color. So the first thing we want to do is define the border, which is just going to be a 1 pixel solid border of a color that we'll use a variable for, which is going to be called color button border. Next, we want to apply a border radius. As you can see, these borders are slightly curved, so we'll say border radius, and this is just going to be equal to 0.5 rem. Next is the padding around our text, so that our button is a little bit wider than it is tall. To do that, we'll say 0.5 rem on the left and right, and 0.5 rem on the top and bottom, and 1 rem on the left and the right. Next, we're going to have a font size for our button, so that they're easy to see. We'll make it slightly larger than our normal font at 1.2 rem. We want to make sure that we set the font family here to be Gotham rounded. So just like this, Gotham rounded. And the reason that we need to do that is because by default, the font family on buttons is not equal to your root font family. Next, we want to change it so that our cursor is equal to the pointing cursor. So let's say cursor pointer. This essentially means that when we hover over a button, we'll actually get this hand instead of the normal cursor. And lastly, we want to remove underlines. So we'll say text decoration none. And we want to align all the text in the center. So we'll say text align center. And that's all the base styling that we need to do for our button. So now let's work on the styling for our specific individual buttons. The first one we'll have is a button primary, and this button is going to be the color of this button right here. So we first want to define the color of the text, which we're going to set here to another variable called the color button primary text. Make sure I spelled color correctly. There we go. And we want to do the same thing for the background color. So this background color is going to be again a variable where we'll say color button primary, and we want this to be background instead of text. There we go. And we can define these variables up above here inside of a root object. Our first variable is going to be that color button primary background. We want to set this to HSL again. We're going to use that same root value for our color, so we can say color base hue. And then the next things we want to do is we want to set 100% saturation and 83% lightness. There we go. Now we can work on doing the color for the text. So we'll say color button primary text. And this again is going to be HSL, the same exact variable for our base. So we'll say color base hue. And here we want to do 100% for the saturation and 20% for the lightness. Close that off. And lastly, we want to do the actual border color. So we'll say color button border, which in our case is just going to be a simple black. And there we go. This is going to be our primary button. So now if we go to our author's search page right here, scroll down, find our author's index, and now we can add that class to our different tags. So here we can say we want a class of button and button primary. We can copy this down to our other link as well. And then we want to do the same thing for our delete form. So inside of that delete form, this button right here is again going to have the classes of button, but this one is going to be button danger instead of button primary, since we want it to be this nice red color over here. Now that we have that done, let's save that. And you'll notice none of our styles are being applied over here. And let's go look at our main.css. And it looks like I misspelled buttons here. So we'll correct that, save it. And now you can see all of our buttons are showing up. They're not quite positioned correctly yet, but that's okay. The actual styling of the coloring is there, and that's what matters. Now we can work on styling our delete button. So if we go back into our buttons.css, we can do another class here for button danger, which is what's applied to our delete button here. And we can style this using the exact same way that we styled our button primary. We'll actually just copy this down because it'll be quicker than retyping it. And we just need to change our variable names here from button primary to button danger, and same thing for the background color. Now that we have that done, let's scroll all the way to the top and actually define these variable colors. The first one we have is going to be the color of our button danger background. And this again is going to be HSL. But instead of using the normal base hue that we've been using the entire time, we're going to use a new variable, which we're just going to call color danger hue. And this we're going to define in our actual variables CSS. Next, we're going to want to set the lightness or the saturation here to 100%, and we're going to set the lightness to be 83%. Next, we want to define the color of the text, so we'll say color button danger text. And this text color here is just going to be a simple black text, so we'll just define it as black here and close that off. We can save that, and you'll notice that our background color here is no longer being applied to our button, and that's because we don't have a hue here for our color danger hue. So let's define that inside of our root variables right here. And the way that we're going to define this is by doing a little bit of math. So hue values are from 0 to 360, and we know that we want our danger color to be essentially the opposite color of our base color here. So we can create what's called a variable. We'll just call this color danger hue offset. We're going to set this to 180, which is half of 360. We then can define our color danger hue right here, which is color danger hue. And this is just going to be a simple calculation. We'll say calculate our variable for color base hue. And we want to essentially just subtract it from the offset variable that we defined right here. So let's copy in that offset variable. And we can end that with a semicolon. And essentially this color danger hue is just going to be the exact opposite of our color base hue. And as you can see, we get that nice red color. Now, for example, we change this to some other value, let's say 100, and save it. You see that they're still completely flipped. Change it to be 300, again, they're still completely flipped. Or if we change it to even 0, again, they're completely flipped. So that way we can easily see what our delete is and that it's different than our actual normal buttons. It also allows us to change the color of our site at will, which is really nice to do. Now with that out of the way, let's go and finish up our styling of our buttons, because we want to be able to have a hover effect. As you can see over here, when we hover, the color of our buttons actually changes. But when we hover over here, nothing happens. So let's make something happen. We'll first create variables for this. So we're going to create a color button primary background, and we want this to be dark. Essentially, it's going to be the darker version from when we hover over it. And this is just going to be very similar to our normal color. So we're going to use the same exact hue, which is color base hue. We're going to use the exact same saturation here as well of 100%. The only thing that's really going to change is the actual lightness value, which will be 73% instead of 83%. Let's do the exact same thing down here for our danger background. We want to change this to be danger background dark. And again, instead of 83%, we'll use 73% here for the color for when we hover. Also, we want to change the color of our text itself. So let's copy down our text here, paste it, and we'll drop the lightness again 10%. So instead of 20, we'll put 10, and we'll do the exact same thing here for our danger text, but this is going to be still black, but again, we'll change this to say dark. I'm going to do the exact same thing for our text here, dark, and essentially all this is doing is creating a darker variant of all of our colors that we've already used so that we can use this on our hover. Now down here, we can copy our button primary, and we can say on hover, what we want to do is we want to use the dark variant of all of these different variables. So we'll just append all of these with the word dark, do the exact same thing for danger, append these with dark, and make sure that we only do this on hover. Now if we save and hover, you can see that the color of our buttons and text is changing as needed based on the variables we defined up here. Now the last thing we have to do is to actually space out these buttons on this page so that they look properly correct. To do that, let's go back to the index page for our authors, which is right here, and we want to wrap all these buttons inside of a single div. So we'll create a div, we're going to give it a class here of button row. And this button row class is going to contain all of our different links on our page. So let's make sure we close out that div, just like this. Get that in the right position. There we go. And now instead of our buttons.css, we can actually create some styles around that button row. The first thing we want to do is we want to change the display of these to be flex so that they're all lined up right next to each other. And we want to change the align items to be flex start so that all of the items will align at the very beginning of the container. This makes it so the delete button will show up at the end of our list here. Also, we want to put some spacing around these elements. So again, we'll select that button row, and we want to select every single child of that button, so essentially all of our different buttons. And all we want to do is we want to set the margin to be on the left side to have 1 rem. This will just help space these buttons out from each other. And again, let's copy this, paste it down, and we want to select the first child. And we just want to remove that margin on the left so that it doesn't add any extra spacing on the furthest left element. Now if we save that, you'll see that all of our buttons are lined up right next to each other and they have spacing between them, which is perfect. Now with all of that done, we can commit this code to Git and to Heroku. So let's add all of our changes. We're just going to add a commit message. I'm just going to say added general styles. Make sure that's spelled correctly. There we go. And we'll push that to our repository. And then after that's done, we're also going to push to Heroku. So we'll git push Heroku master. And now that that's done deploying, we can open up our application in Heroku, and you can see that all of the styles we created are being applied, which is perfect. And that's nearly all of the general styles for our application. In the next video, we're going to take a look at styling all of our form field elements, as well as applying all of the styles from this video to the rest of the pages of our application. You can find that video linked over here when it comes out. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos in this series. Thank you all very much for watching, and have a good day.